Good morning, everyone. I spoke with Ali a couple of days ago, and I realised there's some concerns coming up in the studio, and I want to talk to some of them right now, as well as talk about a few projects that I think are relevant. No doubt we will talk more about this on Monday. One of the issues that came up was the need to do a messy model and the why. The why is because it's a great way of thinking and it takes you off your screen and it can be very messy. So I thought I'd show you a few examples. It's very interesting where these things lead into assignment 3. As a master's program, assignment 3, you'll be going down into Australian standards and into some detail. So it's good to be working at this stage in a very messy way. And I'm not going to be asking you to do a polished model for assignment 3. But the inclusion of something potentially messy is to be considered. Here's some models from the last couple of years with fourth years, and I'm going to just click quickly through them, I hope. Here, this one just putting some rocks together and some chalk drawing. This other one using a bit of foam core, and it's a bit more detail, but notes some computer drawing on top of it. This one using photography of just a bit of blue magnetic sand, I think, and pop sticks. This one using from memory. Hang on, I might have a few photos. Oh, this, sorry, I'm just running through some photos I quickly got together. This one was more about times and this idea of choosing a time measure. And this student, sorry, I don't know everyone's names at my tongue, they're fourth years, I've just grabbed them off the last 2 years. But talking in generations, I think it was Louis Parsons actually, talking in generations and looking at their site as phases of working on, so contingent on each phase in one generation of lifespan or another generation, so a long lifespan of working on a project. Louis was looking at contamination, and I always thought this was a good, effective graphic of just talking about contaminated soil in section. Again, this was a model, so just looking at some lighting strips in someone's bedroom and just sketching in some imaging there, getting a sense of a concrete brick with warm strip lighting. So using a model as a way of testing out an idea. This one just clicking back into this idea of time and in section there, and just using percentage can be very good when you're considering time. So what happens at this phase in time? Here we've got 10% cushion stars, 80% plankton, 10% fish. 30 years time, we've got 6% cushion stars down to up to 20% fish. So just you could look back to this in more detail, and the same student doing a similar percentage read, which can be a very effective way of displaying your ideas. Back to a messy model. Looking at ecological communities and pollutants, just using some materials that were at hand. Another messy model, a Tupperware bowl of water, and looking at how salt water and black ink could work, testing out where salt met fresh water. This was Simone Chi from last year, and these were some lovely tests, and photographing them and just looking at the way the water intensity changed and the colour. Again, another model mixed with a section here, mixed with some sense of plan. Another model here mixed with a site photograph, so we know what's happening. So it's well presented digitally, but the model itself has been used to test out a pedestrian bridge crossing in relationship to height. In this case, it was in relation to a coal mound. Again, another model, in some ways using foam core and a bit more formed here, but looking at tidal flat and wetland restoration, using paper up the top to using those harder materials down below. Latham Brook was always into using food. This is probably pastry. I'm a bit unsure what he's used there, this idea of cutting into his site. Latham used chocolate to show sort of flooding possibilities over particular sort of forms. This was one of Latham's. Actually, he did some very, very strong work. And I think it's good to look at strong work. We can all learn from it. This is always an excellent photo montage. Again, we've got this idea of the person in it. We see the back of them. We know it's a ship captain. We're looking from a ship out over a dock. So it's very much of a site that we were focused on last year at Newcastle. Who would be your community? What's the kind of person that would be in your photo montages when you're doing photo montages, three-dimensional illustrative drawings? And we see the whole site. So we've got a combination of what you could call a community member there, a stakeholder, their day-to-day experience, and looking out from memory. It wasn't Latham, but another student in class accessed one of the ship captain's Instagram accounts and got this photograph, and then was able to use it. It sort of went through the class a little bit, which was a very useful share of material. From memory, this is Latham again. He was always a little bit obsessive with using food, and here he was using something like a violet crumble and looking at contamination and erosion and how they would cut into land and what they would face up there at the port. Another student name just left my head, but a more formed model. Again, another Latham one. He did several models. He making a cake, showing contamination, contaminated water, a terrarium kind of model. From memory, this was looking at salt marsh and the growth of salt marsh. Another model looking at sea level rise. This was a series of images, I think, and there were different things put in this plastic box, filling it with water and seeing what happened with height. This in here, I think it was cranes, soap dispensers representing cranes from the Newcastle docks. And here we had potential condition of inundated industry. It doesn't show so clearly, it doesn't matter. It's the test that was very important to try to come to terms, you yourselves to come to terms with what does happen with sea level rise, what does happen when salt meets fresh. These are the sort of things you could be testing. What does happen with low light at night? What does happen with some of these sort of phenomena? I'm moving around here. I was just grabbing some images and popping them in. This up the top, this is off my Pinterest, and it's a room for river image, but certainly this idea of where you may have what Astrid talked about as a dual system, a wet and dry design system. So you could potentially have a dual path system, a sort of path system that always stays dry, maybe that's back up into the suburb, into the roads, and a wet system that is down within this wet area, and as it becomes more frequently flooded over the next 80 years, it could have different ways of crossing related to flood. Imagine that kind of expression where the path, it just goes down underneath a high tide mark, and at high tide you can't walk across, or you have to take a more playful way. This is actually, I think, an extension of a Mary Miss project, and I want to talk into that project. And likewise, this is also a project in the Netherlands. A little unsure of the engineering of this, but the idea of it and the concept of it as an extension of the Mary Miss project, I think, is very interesting. Again, I put all of these up here for a particular reason. I want to talk about them and refer back to them after looking at the Mary Miss project. But this, I think, was for an art exhibition. I'm not sure if this is a permanent bridge. But this idea of people walking ankle deep through water is highly poetic, and on this site, a very possible and likely and absolutely way, an absolute potential of the site. Now, can you purposely control that or bring that forward a little bit? Can you have people dip into water? I've just popped this in here, this image on the right. This was, I came across this from a landscape architect friend who's just been in Germany a few weeks ago, talking about the, it's got a name. I'll have to get you the name so you can look it up. It's a German name, and I thought it would be on that site, on that image. Anyway, this idea of putting very purposeful experiences into paths, and this is in a German wildlife park. It's very near Munich. And this idea that you have different materials and it's crunchy and it's soft, and we see it happen again. I don't read German. Landsberger Wildpark, but there's a particular place. This is in the same part, this image on the right, and you can see I've quickly grabbed them off the internet. But he said it's quite amazing. You walk along and sometimes there's crunchy paths, sometimes there's very wet paths, and this purposeful wet path that dips down and kids and adults on summer days wet their feet. And it's even purposely given a handrail. So this idea of purposefully taking people into the water, I think is a super relevant one for our site. And these kinds of ways of thinking, these small details, I think could be really useful for us. Now, going into Australian standards, this will be a very interesting, which we will do in assignment 3, taking projects into Australian standards. How we deal with water and the depth of water allowed and a handrail, those sort of details are going to become very important. This is a very mixed bag of images here, but I've put this image in here. It's from an art exhibition in Perth, actually, which is a very dry kind of town, years ago, maybe 30 years ago. But I've always been a bit captivated by this idea of a 50-metre swimming pool in the middle of the street. And I realise I'm having some discussions with some of you particularly talking about streets. And I think this idea of what can you do in a street? How can you imply water? And certainly wetlands and water sense of urban design is one of these. But how do we create a bigger culture of knowing about water inundation? And I do wonder about the idea of installations or paintings on the road, and I will talk more into this with a couple of other images. We don't need that image there. We don't need these. I just grabbed a couple. These were off one of Latham's projects also last year, and I thought I'd pop it in here because working with that multiple scale, extra large down to extra small, and bringing in information around this, even about policy down to local council, seasonal information. It's a really terrific way of doing it. And he does it again, both with invisible forces and visible forces. And there's something we haven't talked enough about, and that is this idea of making meaningful drawings. And in a way, versus me telling you exactly what drawings to do, I'm much more interested that you create meaningful drawings about your project. Now, Latham here was doing this in this multiple scale way and giving us a sense of what the site was about. But I think he's done a very good job of it. Even that seasonal calendar, the middle scale there in the seasonal, like it's suddenly within a multiple scale way of thinking, which makes it very powerful. Some sections from 4th year students last year. And again, this idea of sort of photo montage plus section, how you make meaningful drawings and how you combine your graphic skills. And again, the same thing here, where we get a section talking about what's happening under the water with what's happening in meaningful drawings. This is not Latham's, this is Lachlan Miller, that's his name. He did a very good layout of his meaningful drawings in his plan into his final 5 or 6 weeks. You know, what I'm going to be drawing. And this is something you can begin to be doing now. I haven't asked you to do it, but it's something you could be starting to think about now, because assignment 3 will be an extension of assignment 2, this idea of filtering your information, different communities, long-term, short-term, mid-term. So I think just looking over this and how Lachlan has been able to think through that, I think could be useful. This was also one of Lachlan's sections, and we have the same kind of issues here. Sections of tidal change, sections of sea level rise, and sections of storm surge. So last Tuesday and Wednesday night, we had king tides. We had very mild weather. We had not had a lot of rain. Now, if we'd had those king tides in a storm, and if it was a La Nina kind of time and it was very wet, as opposed to we'd had 2 very dry months, I suspect we would have had flooding issues in the Rockdale area. We didn't. Now, this sort of section starts to explain that very clearly. It's not a complicated drawing, but this idea of combining photo montage images of the site really helps ground your drawings into site specificity. This was, oh my God, can't remember everyone's names, but I can't, the name is escaping me. 4th year from last year, but got very focused on salt marsh. And in these sort of sections, it was early in the term, he was already, Simon, was very focused on salt marsh and really starting to draw it and how important it is. It became a very beautiful project. In all honesty, he completely bombed out in assignment 2. He had some personal issues going on, and then did a beautiful final project. So, you know, studio terms are a funny beast, and you'll find you'll have good weeks and bad weeks, but hopefully you can have a good ending. But I think this idea of some detailing into Saltmarsh can be very useful. Again, a great multiple scale drawing. Weeds found on site. We get the whole site, we get a section, and we get the detail. Weeds found on site. I mean, that's just a terrific drawing. And here's a terrific section. I think I've chopped a bit of it off, but a little bit. But we get the site, and we get a section within it telling us about contaminated soil. Now, I can imagine on your site, we could have the site and a section telling us about things like wetness of the soil, inundation, etc. Now, I'm going to come off that and come into a PowerPoint presentation that I'm hoping is going to, hooray, load up. Messy models, we've talked a little bit about them. So I've put them in here in this assignment too. Of course, you can not do them. I have put them in the rubric. I'm going to leave them in the rubric. It's only fair to the people that get them done. But you are missing out on an opportunity to really explore something that is potentially confusing to you, or you don't know what to do. A messy model really helps you kind of look at it and try and work something out, maybe the way the light works on something, maybe the way lighting works, maybe the extent of a route, maybe how sand gets wet, like actually how does it get wet, maybe the view, maybe the steepness of an edge, maybe, you know, anything, but testing that out. So we will look at, just in the next few minutes, we'll look at a couple of projects related to time and a couple of projects related to water. I'll come back to time in a minute. Firstly, I want to talk about these few projects, particularly Mary Miss. I've always been a big fan of Mary Miss's work. She's an American, sort of comes out of a land artist movement, I think, but she's been practicing and is still practicing. So there's 2 projects I want to have a quick look at. One is Greenwood Ponds and the other is Flow. We'll have a quick look at the Aspect Sydney Park project and a little image I got from Canberra Mall a few days ago. This is the Mary Miss Greenwood Pond project. So some of you might have seen it. It's 1996. I think for those of you that are particularly working up in Scarborough Ponds area, I think this way of immersion and this idea of being in the water potentially and thinking about the water paths or water humans as a sort of cyborg, like how do you get them to relate to each other? And I think what Mary Miss is doing here is grappling with that. And we get this inverted room, which I just think is just brilliant. And you can see this is 1996. So I think some of those Dutch projects we saw earlier where the bridge goes into the water, the Moses Bridge goes into the water where Moses parts the sea. I think it comes from this sort of thinking and this exploration. But I've always thought this room within the water is an incredibly wondrous thing. And I would think up at Scarborough Ponds, particularly with all those the toy boat people that form a big crowd there on Saturdays, whether this could be some sort of interesting approach, how, you know, you could potentially involve pollution traps and all sorts of things and ways of cleaning, but how do you get people to become very, very observant of the water? There's the pollution traps there. You know, it's just an interesting idea. This is the same project, and Mary Miss plays with this idea of the belvedere. The belvedere is an Italian term meaning the beautiful view. And on a flat site, sometimes it doesn't take much to get a great view. You just need to go up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, about 10 steps. And it's very purposeful. And she creates a small space. And I want to refer us back to what Astrid talked about as sort of proportions of these kind of gathering spaces. You know, a small space. Here again, the same project, Greenwood Pond, double site, how you go into the water. Now here we have Aspect approaching this idea in a more probably garden-esque sort of sandstone way, in the stepping stones kind of way. It's got other attributes. I think it's got a different finish really. It's just less stylized. But I think this idea of how you cross water is something all of you, whether you're in a wide site up at Scarborough Ponds or a narrow site on Baddobarong or a site with a horizon view like up at Scotts Park, I think all of you will need to be and should be testing out ideas that are interesting, creative, immersive ideas of how you engage with the water and how people cross it. And I think you should all explore things beyond best practice walking bridges. I'm putting that to you. This is an image I took down in Canberra a few days ago. Our kids are on school holidays, so we zipped down there, did some mountain biking. But I did notice in their main mall, and Andrew must know this terribly well, there's a lot of art. But even their drains, and this is where this has come up from talking with Ali, why are we having to draw a council detail? And this harks back to that same idea of Prince Alfred Park and the lighting. I think if you can start to know some reality details of what the council are doing now with water, and it may be a concrete culvert, it may be the existing bridges, how can you add more awareness and more water thought to those elements? Can you change them? Can you tweak them a bit? Rather than just get rid of them and I'm going to draw a whole new perfect world. Sadly, the world's not like that. If a tunnel was being built up it, but it's not, it would go underneath it. But if a tunnel exit was being built up it, like on the north side of President Avenue, then you would have carte blanche. You'd have a new way of thinking about the whole site. But our site is not that. Working with the gritty, small realities of the site and likely small budgets is really the way forward. And so I think these kind of small installations draw awareness about pollution, and it's in an eating area, these drains, but it draws your attention to the drain, where the water goes. I think it's subtle and sort of easy. This is another Mary Miss project. It's called Flow, and it's a different sort of engagement, and it seems to be she's placed these kind of mirrors around with these dots, red dots, and you line them up and you see things in your reflection. You're within the mirror. You see things within the reflection, and they also tell you pieces of information. I think it's a really interesting, low-key, sort of art installation way of dealing with this obviously swampy, wet site. The project brings together the cognitive power of science with the effective power of art to raise river awareness. Now, I think as landscape architects on this kind of site, we are dealing in this sort of realm. And I'm just suggesting this may be, the kind of installation in Baddobarong Creek. Like, how do you do small things? Or how do you have an ecological area, but you also give delight to humans at a low impact scale? So I think this project, much like we saw in the Fresh Kills project, where they had artists on boats taking people out and talking about it, I think Mary Miss's 2008 to 2011 Flow project sits in that sort of vein, just drawing people's attention to what's happening around them. Here I am down in Canberra again, just photographing materials as we begin to build up a sort of material palette of inundation landscapes, these reinforced plastic, steel, fibre, I think it's called composite fibre. Wow, it's got an acronym, I always forget it. Plastic fibre, composite, steel, reinforced, I think, something like that. But again, and this is in a very, not banal, but sort of municipal way, I suppose. Functional materials over this small creaky waterway down in Canberra. But this idea of dealing with the edge, which has to draw our attention to where materials meet and you begin to deal with the edges. I think as we go down into detail, and I've asked you to look to 1 to 10 in assignment 2 at part of your project. So I want you to start looking into this level of detail, because that is where assignment 3 will go. Okay, that's why I'm asking you to look at it now, just to get you sort of start to think to that level. Time. Now, Marty Franch's Girona Shores project, I've mentioned a few times, and I gave you some links. So hopefully you all know it, and I'm sorry about the fuzzy image here, but it is a very wonderful project. There's a reason it was awarded the International Award a couple of years ago. It's very much a maintenance project, but it's worth going online and getting a better image of this image I've grabbed here. This is off the Lanzine site, I think, or it might be off Marty Franch's own site. But this maintenance plan, and it happens over time. You know, how many times you mow the lawn, how many times you whippersnip the higher lawn, how many times you clip with prunes the shrubs, how many times you take off some of the larger limbs of the trees, and the impacts on the birds and people, and how this happens over time. One of the nicest sequences in that Marty Franch project is this idea of, which we will be talking more and more about, what's time and things contingent. So from what I understand happened here, again, I'm sorry about the bad image, there is a town steeple in the middle of the image in the far distance. And so year one, with almost no money, they have built a twig arch. And it gives emphasis and importance to this journey. So to speak, in Astrid language, there's a node. We're on a wayfinding promenade, and something happens here, and our eye is led to this framed view. And I've heard Marty Franch speak about this, and he said then the plan is then over time, in the next 5 or 10 years, they get more funding and they build a much more long-term scenario there. And they might look at that, they might do it in bronze, or they might create a table and chairs as well, or something with a bigger budget. So how do you work with small budgets over time? And Marty Franch is giving us a wonderful technique for that. And again, they do it here. They rough cut seats out, but they locate them within existing stone. So suddenly the existing stone is kind of like a part of the suite of furniture, and these rough cut pieces of timber become chairs. And you can see in that top left where they've lofted down a tree on site, and they've got somebody to make these timber seats out of them. They won't last forever, but they'll last maybe for 10, 15 years, in which time you've built up a culture with your community to engage in this space. Why that space? I suspect there's some good elements about it. And that's what you can be doing on your site, particularly in these first 10 years, how you draw people's attention to these key moments that have fundamental assets of the site at it. It might be a view out, or it might be existing trees, or it might be where the fresh water meets the salt water, or it might be etc. Again, on the Marty Franch project, this idea of just placing 2 seats, again in a particular location with great thought and this culture of care, providing moments for people to pause and gather. Public space, private space, there's a moment of solitude within a public promenade walk. This is a little image I just clicked the other day somewhere in Paddington, thinking of so many of your sites with fences up against them, and I thought, is there a way to just start breaking down some of those fences? And of course they're privately owned, but could you reintroduce a different language? Is there a transition language of the fence rather than fully open? Is there a filter? And that how do we get this softer edge between public and private? Maybe that's something somebody would like to play with. Benchmark is a brilliant project by the 2 sisters, Naomi Kumar and Susie Kumar. Naomi Kumar's an artist, and Susie Kumar is a landscape architect. She went on to marry Chris Sawyer, and they formed Site Office down in Melbourne, and we'll have a look at another one of their projects, the St Kilda Foreshore, in a minute. But Susie in the early 90s did this project, and I've always thought it's a winner. I think the budget was about $18,000, and that in that middle picture, you just can't quite see it. It's a huge, long bench. So I think the brief was for a piece of art, and they changed it to a piece of public furniture around a footy oval down in Melbourne. So it's a dead flat seat, and because it's dead flat, the height of the seat changes. So it's very low in that top and it's high at the other end where the slope of the land is different, but the red line stays the same, like a datum. Now, imagine the poetics you could do with that, with this idea of sea level rise. I think it's a nice scale of dealing with sport ovals, like many of you are around the Scarborough Ponds region, and so many sport ovals up and down, like where you create seating. How big can a seat be? How big could it be? There's that red line. It's so graphically minimal and powerful at the same time. There's that detail at the end, and there's some more details again. Robust materials, the gravel shift from the lawn to the seating. And I'm just throwing in here this idea of the long bench. This is a quick image from Voigt Landscape Architects, who are in Switzerland. They have done some brilliant projects, but particularly that top image, but how people use public space. And again, what is the scale of your spaces? So some of you will have much more intimate sort of spaces than others. So I think around the Civic Reserve, I think around the Scarborough Ponds big wide park, that area where you've been walking with, you walked with Andrew, and this sense of feeling uncomfortable walking out in the middle. You know, is there potential for a long seat? How you address that, what it is, how many things can it be? This idea of multiple. You know, can a seat also be the datum of a height line? Can it also be a graphic punch? Can it also be a light? How many things can a seat be? This idea of multiple uses. Here we are still with the amazing Susie Kumar, but now with her partner, husband, Chris Sawyer, with St Kilda Promenade, and this creation of a gathering node along the promenade. And this is the example that Astrid talked about. This is, I was down there about a year ago, and that's a little edge detail of it. The material language continues of timber up into the vertical surfaces. I've always liked this project and this idea of water and creating seating spaces and that are full of poetry and full of meaning. So we've got a fountain, we've got a pond, we've got single chairs, we've got long bench, and we've got, I don't actually think it's water. I think it's a German word, but in my mind, I always think of it as water. And because your site is so full of water, you know, how could you potentially, in 10 to 20 years, maybe you've got a bigger budget, could you potentially grow a detail to be a much more beautiful, refined detail? So for any of you that have got an architecture background or an interior design background in your undergraduates, this might be something you might like to explore, the detailing of a public space, gathering space, the proportions of it, what it's made of, how it weathers, how it engages with water or the tide. This is another example from the same group. I'm sorry, I haven't written down the name. It's a book I own now. Ask me, I'll remind us on Monday. But again, I'd like to think that that says water. It doesn't, it says a German word. But, you know, think how you could engage with the water's edge, what they could be. Could they be lights? Could they be seats? Could they be filters? How can we add more beauty to this environment? How can we add more culture of care? Some beautiful sections that I just thought I'd pop up just because of the detail. This is, again, fourth is from the last couple of years, but, you know, some real detail there in showing the roots, how salt marsh works. Oh, sorry, not salt marsh. It's gathering the base, pressing the base of each spine between the thumb and the forefinger, revealing a forward seed. It is what? It's spinifex. It's spinifex seeds, but there's some beautiful detailing in this section just of the plant itself. So when you feel overwhelmed, I suggest go back to some of your core thinking and just start to draw it. Draw it, draw it, draw it. Draw it in 3D, draw it in a section, and you'll, even if you have not a lot of ideas, what we want to be doing is pushing, you know, the best ideas down into good detail. This idea of a small room, I just threw that in there. You know, Ballast Point Park over in Balmain has this sort of odd, really. So I don't think it's so relevant, but it is a little bit. A small interior room. Now, whether something like that could happen out at Scott Park and frames of view or something like that, potentially over to Alison Page's sculpture, that may be a way to think about Scott Park as a fundamental asset of it being the view out. And I've just tapped in there Astrid's 14 to 18 metres, 29 metres max, kind of proportional space, the septet proportions. I think those septet proportions again, is there a way any of you on any scale of your sites could look at how you create potentially mobile or movable gathering spaces. Here we have, this is just off Pinterest, here we have, I'm assuming, a mobile cinema. Wonderful, wonderful. And this is TopTech One, who's a great firm. I follow their Insta account. This is their office garden in Berlin. I just put it here in relation to that proportion that Astrid was talking about, this 14 to 18 metres. And I'd be kind of interested about it, actually, just what the proportions of this space are. What makes a comfortable gathering space for people? Again, from Astrid's slides, but I'm just repeating it because I think this idea of a language at the promenade, the idea of how this could be a threshold or an entrance as you come in from the suburbs. Could you use something like this then on a bridge, a material quality about it, or colour? You know, how else could you use this? Design the journey. I think that's about it. Oh, this idea of painting back into the roads. I just want to connect this image here back to that one I showed earlier of the 50-metre pool on the road. You know, I think this idea of doing something within some of those suburban streets that are the entrances into the park, somehow where you announce the waterways deeper into the suburbs, I think could be a way to spatially deal with the small budget, normal suburbanness of it in the short term. You know, could you be, you know, I don't know, painting the roads, painting the footpaths, planting them, painting them. You know, what space have you got? Painting the car park areas. Oh, there it is again. I popped at the end. And that might be it. Oh, there's Alison Page's sculpture. I think I've read more about it, actually, and I will share more over the week. But I hadn't realised it's a combination of one of the first ships that came into Botany Bay and the skeleton structure of it, as well as being a whale skeleton. I think it's a remarkable piece. I'm not sure whether you can see it from Scott's Park or not. I wish somebody could tell me. A TopTech project, again, this idea of effective water management, but with great concrete. And many of you have these sites. Jad, I think you're dealing with some of those concrete sort of suburban water outlets. Whether there's other ways you can begin to work with them and have moments of beautiful concrete near them, or use the vernacular language. Can there be skate parks, seating? And I think this project by TopTech begins to speak into this. We have a concrete skate park that also acts as a reservoir for an effective water management system. Amazing. These are some sections of my own from 1997 as a final project student. And we're looking at water, and these sections trying to show tides coming in. This is down in Melbourne, and different depths, and being very clear with colour and trying to show this is high tide, low tide, you know, mid tide. And dealing with flat sites, this is a quick snap of mine from over in a suburb in Sydney, in Castlecrag. I see it around, that's down around in some of the coastal areas, where footpaths are engraved into, and by that engraving, this is Edinburgh Road, after rain, it captures the water. I've always thought that's a beautiful, small thing. And as there's so much suburban fringes to many of your sites, you know, some of these smaller ways of thinking and detailed ways of thinking, particularly moving to 1 to 10, I think become relevant. This is the Clovelly Bay education sign that I just popped in here because it gives such detail about the fish, yet no one seems to know a lot about the creatures in the Rockdale waterways. And even just giving clear, straight information like this and having a beautiful sign, it's not beautiful, but a clear colour sign, go on, put some colour on it, could be very wonderful. Whereas at the moment, the signage everywhere is awful. And this is the last slide. I don't know, I can't even remember where I snapped it. I think it's a pretty interesting thing to think about. Ageism, homophobia, sexism, racism, let's get rid of them all and have speciesism. And this speaks into Indigenous ways of thinking where within the circle we were all equal. That is it for now. Hopefully you can watch this before Monday. If not, watch it during class while we are doing desk crits. Okay, bye for now.